Expats Episode 4 follows Margaret and Clark as they arrive at the morgue on the mainland to identify the body. Margaret experienced a plethora of emotions as she waited to be taken to the room where the body was kept. Her motherly instinct told her that Gus was still alive, and she was confident that she would be proved right. But simultaneously, she could not completely ignore the possibility of finding her son in the morgue. As Clark and Margaret waited at the morgue for what seemed like hours, Hillary got stuck in the elevator with her mother, and it eventually led to an outburst. Mercy and David play a game of being brutally truthful with one another, and we watch the pair bond over their shared trauma. Hillary, also known as Harpreet, panicked when she realized that her mother had arrived in Hong Kong from Los Angeles. Brenda was critical of Hillary from the minute they met. While she believed she was only being honest with her daughter, she failed to realize the impact her words had on Hillary. From criticizing Hillary's walk to her breath, the conversation soon escalated into an argument as she tried to shame Hillary for her life choices. As a South Asian woman, Brenda believed that to keep one's husband close, it was important to have children, and Hillary's decision to not become a mother was the reason why her marriage was falling apart. Hillary was flabbergasted to hear her mother give marriage advice when her marriage was nothing short of traumatizing. At a young age, Hillary realized that her father abused her mother. She later found out about his extramarital affair and the children he had out of wedlock. Hillary never supported her mother's decision to be with a man who disappointed her all her life, but Brenda believed she had no choice. Hillary's childhood memories consisted of her patting makeup on her mother's face to hide the signs of abuse. Her childhood had significantly impacted her mindset. Maybe she was afraid of becoming a terrible parent, and she did not wish to make a decision simply because it was expected of her. She was happy being on her own, but unfortunately, people like Brenda would always see her as an incomplete woman and blame her for her husband's infidelity. The language barrier made it all the more difficult for Margaret and Clark to convince the morgue warden to hasten the process. The warden ended up locking them in a room until someone from the facility arrived. After losing Gus, an unintentional distance had grown between Margaret and Clark. She was busy finding ways to track down Gus and cope with the anxiety of losing her son in a foreign country, while he hoped for a resolution and focused on Philip and Daisy. Clark was bothered by the lack of normalcy in the lives of their children, and as much as it pained him to think, he would rather prefer closure than the clueless existence that they had lately been living. Margaret blamed Clark for deciding to stay back in Hong Kong instead of moving to New York, whereas Clark held Margaret responsible for not taking care of their children. He believed Margaret's decision to not take Essie along resulted in the disappearance of Gus, though they both quickly realized that there was no point in engaging in a blame game. They could either hold one another responsible for the unfortunate incident, or they could tightly hold on to each other in this time of crisis. Margaret and Clark's opinions differed when it came to deciding where they wanted to settle down. Clark intended on moving to New York with the kids because they had been repeatedly requesting that they head back home, but Margaret believed that once they moved out of the foreign country, it would suggest that they had given up on Gus, and she was not ready to do so. She hoped that one day she would be able to find Gus and was prepared to go to any lengths to bring him home. When Margaret and Clark were taken into the room for identification, Margaret started to laugh hysterically. The fear of finding out the truth resulted in her losing complete control of herself. Clark helps Margaret calm down, and at the end of Expats Episode 4 of The Face of the Unidentified Body is revealed to Clark and Margaret. Clark broke down after seeing the face, and Margaret confirmed that the body was not that of their son Gus. The fear of seeing his son in a similar condition perhaps resulted in Clark's breakdown. Margaret felt a little confident about her motherly instinct, and she showed courage in the final moment. Margaret was still hopeful, but the constant directionless searching left Clark exhausted. It had been a year since they lost their son, and deep down, Clark knew there was barely any hope of finding him again, yet the lack of closure made it impossible for them to move on. Mercy preferred being a lone wolf, and David brought complications into her life that she was not entirely ready to deal with. Perhaps she was afraid of getting attached to him, knowing that he was cheating on his wife with her. As much as she ignored the moral dichotomy of an affair, there must have been times when she wondered about their situation. David was an older man with responsibilities while she was still figuring out her life, and it was their trauma and self-hatred that brought them closer to each other. Mercy blamed herself for the disappearance of Gus, and we find out in Episode 4 of Expats that David, too, lived through a similar experience. Remember in the first episode when Mercy spoke about the many cases where no one cared about the ones responsible for accidents? She mentioned the case of a boy who paralyzed his brother, and it turned out to be David's story. David and his twin brother Danny returned home from school one afternoon, and as usual, they were playing around when all of a sudden, Danny's neck hit the coffee table and he was left paralyzed. Every time David looked at him, he was reminded of his mistake, which is why he avoided visiting his family. He knew that his entire family was disappointed in him and blamed him for the tragedy, but no one explicitly told him on his face. David could relate to the guilt that Mercy experienced, and that was the reason why he sympathized with her. A second after David left the apartment, Mercy rushed to her bathroom and threw up. David entered the flat to check on Mercy. She assumed it was anxiety and indigestion, but when David jokingly suggested that it could also be a sign of pregnancy, a realization struck Mercy. She wondered if David was really infertile or if he simply said so because his wife never got pregnant. Since Hillary passed all the fertility tests, David figured that he must be the reason why they could not have a child. David was unaware that Hillary was on contraception the entire time, leading to the misunderstanding. David got Mercy 3 pregnancy kits just to be entirely sure. The ending of Expats episode 4 suggests that Mercy is pregnant. David had always been keen on starting a family, and it all comes down to Mercy's decision. Will Mercy get over her fear of being cursed and start a new life with David, or will she choose abortion? Considering Mercy is young and not inclined towards starting a family, could it be that David and Hillary will become the child's guardians and fix their broken marriage? Will the child bring hope to Margaret's life? The ending of episode 4 leaves us with multiple possibilities, and at this point, Mercy's decision can change the course of the series.